Yeah. So the session today is going to be on SAML single sign-on and SAML and LDAP integration with ColdFusion Administrator. So before we start, I just want to give a brief introduction about me. So my name is Megha, and I've been a part of Adobe ColdFusion team for the past 4.5 years now. And some of the major areas that I've worked on since I've been a part of ColdFusion team are performance monitoring toolset, security, ColdFusion lockdown, SAML single sign-on integration with ColdFusion, ColdFusion administrator, REST and web services, and so on. And I've also added my email ID, that is mek@adobe.com. So in case you have any questions, any doubts after the session, please go ahead and email to this email ID. Yeah. So the agenda for today's session is going to be that I've divided this session into two parts. Right. So the first part is going to be SAML single sign-on integration with ColdFusion. And the second part is going to be SAML LDAP integration with ColdFusion Administrator. So the first part here, that is SAML single sign-on integration with ColdFusion. This is a feature that we introduced in ColdFusion 2021. This is mainly SAML sign-on integration with the applications that you build on top of ColdFusion. And as for the SAML LDAP integration with ColdFusion Administrator, this is like an external authentication that we have enabled for ColdFusion Administrator, and this is a feature that we have introduced in ColdFusion 2023. So under the first section, we look at what is single sign-on. Also, we'll see the service provider, identity provider, principal, and metadata exchange. We'll look at the workflow. We will see how you can configure the service provider and identity provider in your ColdFusion. And lastly, we'll look at SAML ColdFusion APIs. And under the second part, we'll see the use case. We'll see what's newly added as a part of this feature. We'll look at user store, and we'll go to the LDAP user group login workflow and also SAML user group login workflow. So the first part, we'll be starting with the first part, that is SAML single sign-on integration with ColdFusion. So single sign-on. What is single sign-on? So single sign-on is an authentication method that enables users to securely authenticate into multiple applications by using just a single set of credentials. So I have a simple example here. So we have a friend Bob here, and Bob basically works in a company that has multiple applications that are built on top of ColdFusion. So they have a clothing website, they have an online streaming application. So now Bob needs to log into all of these applications, maybe to test it or make some changes, or in general he needs to access all of these applications. So what he does, so first clothing website he needs to access, he will type in the URL of the clothing website, and he gets into the login page, and he types in the credentials, and he's able to log into it. Now he wants to log into the online streaming application. So he again opens up the URL for that, and he enters the credentials, and then again he'll be able to log in. So when there are many applications that they are maintaining, and he needs to log into all of these applications, this is a tedious job that he needs to keep on logging into each and every application. So now we bring in this single sign-on into the picture. So now what Bob has done is he's introduced Okta. So Okta is an identity provider, and throughout the session we'll be taking Okta as an example. So he has brought Okta into the picture here, and what he has done is he has registered all of his applications into Okta. So once the registration is done, he simply logs in once into Okta, and Okta does all this checks, it authenticates this user, and now the user is able to log into all of these applications by just signing in once into Okta. So this is a basic what single sign-on is. So now why SAML single sign-on? So first thing, increased productivity. So single sign-on increases employee productivity by reducing the number of times that they would otherwise have to spend signing on to these multiple applications individually, and also dealing with their passwords, right? So the second thing is it decreases password fatigue. So it's obviously a struggle to keep up with huge number of passwords, I think, for everybody. So this generally leads to something called as password fatigue. And generally, this password fatigue eventually leads to simplified passwords, or else password reuse as well. So, by using single sign on, this password fatigue can also be avoided. So, the next is improved security. So, SAML provides a single point of authentication which happens at a secure identity provider. Then SAML transfers the identity information to the service provider. So this form of authentication ensures that credentials are only sent directly to the identity provider. The next thing is loose coupling of directories. So SAML doesn't require user information to be stored, maintained, or synchronized between directories. The next is it enhances user experience. So as we saw, user only needs to sign in once in order to access multiple service providers. So this allows for a faster authentication process and also less expectations from the user to remember these multiple login credentials. The last point here is it reduces costs for the service providers. So with SAML, you don't have to maintain these account informations across multiple services. Identity provider will take up all this hassle for you. Yeah. So the next thing we'll see is principal, service provider, identity provider, and metadata exchange. So in any single sign-on, there are three main entities that are involved. First is principal, second is service provider, third is identity provider. So what is a principal? So as in the previous example we saw, we had our friend Bob there. So Bob can be considered as a principal. So a principal can be usually any user that is requesting some sort of service from an application. And then we have service provider. So the service provider could be any application. So in our case, ColdFusion will be your service provider. So any application that you've built on top of ColdFusion will be acting as a service provider. It could be any application that provides one or multiple services to the user, but they first need to be authenticated to avail these services. And the third entity here is identity provider. So this identity provider acts as an instrument of trust. And the user is authenticated to the identity provider. All the user related information are stored in the identity provider. This service provider will get the state of authentication and authorization of the user from the identity provider. Now, the next important thing here is a metadata exchange. So, in order to develop a trust between the service provider and an identity provider, you need something called as metadata. And when you set up your identity provider, you will be getting this metadata, which you need to provide to your service provider as well, so that the trust is established between both these providers. Right. So we'll move on to the workflow. Yeah. So we'll look at a single sign-on login workflow. So as we said, we have the three entities here. We have our principal, we have the service provider, we have the identity provider. Yeah. And so principal is Bob here, and the service provider, as you can see, there's a clothing website that we have built on top of ColdFusion, and we have taken Okta again as an example for identity provider. So what happens? Now the principal wants to log into this clothing website, and this clothing website is already registered in Okta. So he has raised a single sign-on login request. Now, once principal wants to log into this clothing website, the service provider will send a SAML request to the identity provider, and it will check that this user is not already logged in. And if the user is not already logged in, the principal will be presented with Okta login page. Now, the user will be able to see him being directed to an Okta login page where he needs to provide his Okta credentials. And the principal will provide his Okta credentials, and the Okta will check in its registry and it will authenticate this user. Once the authentication is done from the Okta side, it will create a SAML response, and this SAML response is sent back to the identity provider. This SAML response consists of some information like uh, whether the user is authenticated or not, and if you choose to send some attributes along with the response, that will be sent as well, and few other details which we'll see later. So these are some of the things that will be sent along with the response. And now that the service provider has received the response from the identity provider, it goes ahead and logs the user into the application. Okay, so we saw till now what is single sign-on and all of these things, the entities and everything. So now we'll see how you can configure this identity provider and service provider in ColdFusion. So first things first, in order to even avail this SAML feature in your ColdFusion, you need to install a package named as SAML. So how you can install it is either you can go to your instance home bin location and run cfpm.bat or cfpm.sh based on your OS, and then you type install SAML. So that will install the SAML package for you. Alternatively, you can also install SAML package through the ColdFusion Administrator. So how you can do that is you can navigate your package manager page in your ColdFusion Administrator and go to the available packages section, and you'll find a package named as SAML. Simply click on install and it will install the SAML package for you. So once you have installed the SAML package, if you come to your security page, you'll be able to see two pages here: the IDP configuration and SP configuration. So since we know that our ColdFusion acts as a service provider here, so first thing we'll be configuring is the SP. So we go to the service provider configuration page, and there are two highlighted fields here: entity ID and ACS URL. So these two are the most important ones here. So I'll just give explanation on what these both are. So we have entity ID. So this entity ID is like a unique ID that is unique for each service provider that you add. So you can give any value there, but this is a value that you will also have to provide in your identity provider. So you give an entity ID here, and the next is the ACS URL. So this ACS URL is a page that you get redirected to once your authentication is successful, and that's the page where Okta will send its SAML response to. So this is URL. It could be home page or it could be some intermediate page that you want your Okta response to come to. So that is the URL that you would provide here. So these are the mandatory fields as well. The rest are not mandatory. So after you do this, you can complete your service provider configuration. So now that service provider configuration is done, we move on to the identity provider configuration. So the first thing, you need to do the configuration in Okta. So in Okta, you need to provide the single sign-on URL. The single sign-on URL is nothing but the ACS URL that we saw in our SP configuration page. So give the same URL here, and we have audience restriction, and this is the same as SP entity ID. So these two data you give here, and we have something called as attribute statements. So this attribute statements is you can choose to send some of the attributes along with the SAML response. So as you can see here, I've added first name, last name, and email ID. So what happens is a user logs in, and I am adding this attribute statements, these three attribute statements here. And when the SAML response goes back to the service provider, along with that response, there will also be the first name, last name, and email ID of the user. Let's say in your application you want to say welcome and that person's name. So you can do that by just passing the, let's say, the first name, and your service provider will get the first name of the user who has logged in, and you can simply dump that name saying welcome and that name. You can also pass roles here. Let's say you want a role based kind of, you have a role based kind of application where you want to give certain permissions to some users. You can also add an attribute called as role and give certain roles to each people that are there in your that you have added there. And when the response comes back, by looking at the role, you can also modify your application accordingly. So once your identity provider configuration is done from Okta side, we get the metadata. So as we talked about earlier, the metadata exchange. So we get the metadata from the identity provider here. You can get it in form of URL, or you can simply get the actual metadata, or you can put it in some file, or whichever format you get, we'll be able to put it in the ColdFusion. So what you need to do is get this metadata from the identity provider and give it to ColdFusion. So the last step here is the identity provider configuration in ColdFusion Administrator. That is, go to IDP configuration page, and the URL that we saw in the previous here metadata URL, simply copy it and paste it in this SAML URL. You can either do that, or if you have the raw metadata, you can also go to the import from an existing SAML definition and just paste that metadata. Or if you have an XML, if you have it in a XML file, then you can import that as well. So there are 4 different ways of importing this IDP in Administrator, but this is a simpler one. All are simple, but from Okta side, since you directly get the URL, this would be the most simplest one. So with these 3 simple steps, you have completed configuring your IDP and SP in ColdFusion. So as we saw how to configure this IDP and SP in ColdFusion Administrator, you can alternatively do that using application CFC as well. You simply define this.security.saml settings.idp, and the data that you pass here is same as what you would pass in Administrator as well, like the name and URL. And here we have this.security.saml settings.sp, where I have given currently even the non-required at fields as well, but that's optional. So this structure remains the same as what we have in Administrator. So you can either use Administrator, or you can also define in application CFC. Now, lastly, we'll look at SAML ColdFusion APIs. So these are the APIs that we have introduced as part of the SAML feature. The highlighted ones here are the most important ones. So we'll look at those 3 mainly. So the first thing we have init SAML auth request. So this is a function that initiates a SAML authentication request. So usually you will associate this with the login button. Like if a person clicks on login button, you could trigger this function. So you need to pass the name of IDP and SP here. Relay state is optional. So you pass IDP and SP name here, and you simply call init SAML auth request. And what happens? It initiates the SAML request, and the user will be presented with Okta login page. So as you can see here, I have gotten the Okta login page, and I am giving my username and password for Okta. And once I have given this credentials, Okta will authenticate me, and a response will be sent back from Okta. And how do I get this response? I get this response by using process SAML response function. So in this process SAML response function, I simply pass the name of the IDP and SP that I've added, and I've dumped the response that has come over here just to get an idea of how this response looks like. So the first thing you can see here, there's attributes. So as I had showed before, I had passed my first name, last name, and email ID of the user. So since I've logged in as mek@adobe.com, you can see my email ID and the first name and last name as well in the response that has come from Okta. And it also says authenticated, yes. And there are some other fields like name ID format, and session index, which will be useful during the time of logout. So these are some of the things that you will have to pass during logout time as well: the name ID format, and session index. Right. So we have now init SAML logout request. So just like init SAML auth request, logout request is a similar thing, but for logout. So it initiates a SAML logout request, and you could add this to a logout option or logout button that you have. So trigger this function when someone clicks the logout button, and you pass the name of IDP and SP. Along with that, you also pass the session index, the name ID format. These are the ones that we saw previously in this process SAML response: the name ID format, and the session index. So you pass these, and you call the init SAML logout request. Now again, the logout request is sent to Okta, and the Okta is sending the response back. So the way of reading the response remains the same. You call the same function process SAML response even for logout, and you pass the name of IDP and SP. And during logout, this is all you get from Okta. That is whether the logout has been successful or not. So you will get, if you get yes, that means the logout was successful. If you get no, then the logout was not successful, and it will also log the user out of the application. Yeah, I have a simple app to show. So we look at the app and then I'll come back to any questions that are there. Right. So I have a simple application here. This is just to show in real time how would this look like from a user side. So I have here index.cfm, and this here I have login with SSO, and this login with SSO I have associated it with init SAML auth request. So what happens when I click on this is, as you can see, it's loading. It is taking me to Okta login page. Now I'm going to give my credentials here. And once I give my credentials, now Okta is doing the check. It is authenticating me. And I have internally done a check that if it is successful, it is going to take me to this page. Right. So I have come to this home page of the app right now. And let's say I've done all my thing, whatever purchase I have to do, everything is done. Now I want to log out. Also, before that, you can see here welcome, and I've given my email ID here. And this is what I've gotten from the attribute statement. I had returned my email ID. So I've just written welcome and my email ID here. Now I click on logout, and when I click on logout, it is going to trigger the init SAML logout request, and it will sign me out of this application. Yeah. I think before we move to the second part, let's look at if any question is there. Okay. If there are no questions, I'll move to the second part. Okay. So you cannot avoid jumping to Okta login page, because uh, once you have done the configuration, the entire login flow is controlled by Okta itself. You're just simply sending a login request to Okta. So once this init SAML auth request function is called, it will automatically take you to the Okta login page, and then whatever ACS URL or the single sign-on URL you have given, that is where you will be redirected to once the response comes back from Okta. I hope that answers your question. Yeah. So I'll move on to the second part. SAML LDAP integration with ColdFusion Administrator. Let me share. Yeah. So we'll start with a scenario. what was happening prior to ColdFusion 2023. So we have Bob again, and Bob's company has three main teams. So there's a development team, there's a marketing team, and there's a sales team. And there are many members in each of these teams, and all of them are stored in a user store. So all of this account informations of each of these users and groups are present in a user store. And there's ColdFusion Administrator. So the requirement of Bob here is that he has access to ColdFusion Administrator, and he wants to have he wants to provide access to all of these users as well to ColdFusion Administrator. And I think most of you all would know about user management that we have in ColdFusion. That is, you can add regular users into ColdFusion Administrator, and you can also specify certain roles to each of the users. And according to the roles, the users will be able to access administrator accordingly. Now, uh, when there are multiple groups and users, and Bob has a specific, like let's say he wants development team to have complete access to administrator, and marketing team he wants to do some, give some restrictions, and again for sales team he wants only few pages to be available to them. So when he wants to do that, what he needs to do is he needs to go ahead and add every single user, that is create every individual user, and give them the required roles and permissions. Only then each of the users will be able to log into ColdFusion Administrator. Now, when there's a huge number of users that are present, Bob will have to go ahead and add each of those users into administrator so that they are able to log in. And also the permissions, he will have to individually provide the permissions to each of those users. Right. So with ColdFusion 2023, with the LDAP and SAML integration with ColdFusion Administrator feature that we have, now what Bob needs to do is, uh, when the user store is either LDAP or SAML, so let's say there's group 1, that is development team, there's a group 2 marketing team, and group 3 sales team, and there are multiple users again, and all these are stored in a SAML or LDAP user store. He simply imports these groups or users into administrator, and they so let's say he has imported group 1, he has imported this development team, and there are hundreds users present in this group, and he has given a set of roles and permissions to the group 1. Just by adding this group 1, that is development team, all of the users that are present within the group will also be able to access ColdFusion Administrator, and will also have the roles and permissions what the group has. So it becomes simpler for Bob. He just have to import these groups, and he can also add users individually as well. But group when there are many users present, and in these kind of scenarios, it's very useful for him to import the groups, and all the users present will be able to log into administrator. So we'll see what is newly added as a part of this feature in ColdFusion. So the first thing, configuration of LDAP server in administrator. So we have added a new section where you can add all the details of your LDAP server in administrator, that is the host name, port, and many other, which we'll see later. And once you have added everything, you can also verify the connection. So that's a section that's newly added. And import LDAP users and groups. As I mentioned, you can when you have LDAP users and groups created, you can import those into ColdFusion Administrator, and also import SAML users and groups. You can set permissions for LDAP and SAML users and groups. The setting permission will be in the same user manager page as we had before, but we have a new small little section added for these external authentication types. And you can log into administrator as regular users as well as SAML or LDAP users. So user store. What is a user store? So user store is basically a repository that consists of user accounts and credentials. So this is just to give an idea of what a SAML user store looks like. So again, this is Okta, and in Okta I've created three groups: marketing admin, sales admin, and development admin. And under each of these groups I've added users. So I've added users with the same letter as the group name so that it's easier for us when we look at the demo. So we have development admin group, and we have David and Dan as members under development group. So this is what a SAML user store looks like. And we have LDAP user store. So again, here I've created three groups: development, marketing, and sales. And I have many users, and under, you can see here, development team, I have added members Dan and David. So ColdFusion Administrator external user login. So first things first here, in order to enable this external authentication in ColdFusion Administrator, you need to select this separate username and password authentication option. Right. So yeah, only if you enable this option, you will be able to enable this external authentication. That is because in case of external authentication, that is either SAML or LDAP, it is mandatory to provide a username and password. And as discussed, we would want multiple users to be able to log into administrator. So that is why you need to select this separate username and password authentication in order to enable this feature. So once you've done that, at the bottom of this page, that is a security administrator page, you will be able to see the section external authentication, where there are three options: none, SAML, or LDAP. None simply means that you are not choosing any external authentication type, and you will be able to log in with regular users, or you can select SAML or LDAP. Now we'll see LDAP user or group login workflow. So the first step here is create users or groups in LDAP server. So I've already created groups and users. So this will be the first part. After you have created the users and groups in LDAP server, the next step is going to be add the LDAP configuration and set LDAP as external authentication in ColdFusion Administrator. So in this radio button, you're going to select LDAP. And when you're adding the LDAP configuration for the first time, you would have add LDAP configuration button here, and click on that and provide all the details of your LDAP server. You can also verify connection using this verify connection button. Now the third step is going to be add users or groups to user manager with required roles and permissions. So go to your user manager page and add your users or groups. And finally, you will be able to log into ColdFusion Administrator with the LDAP user. Now, in case of SAML user or group login workflow, again, the first step remains the same. That is, you need to set up your SAML identity provider and assign users and groups. I'm not going to talk again about the setting of identity provider and service provider, all of that, because we have already seen how we can do that. So those things remain the same, and you just simply add your users and groups. And the second step is add your IDP and SP configuration in administrator. That is what we have seen in the previous section. So here as well, you will have to first add your identity provider and service provider configuration. And then the third step is set SAML as external authentication and select the added IDP and SP. So here in the radio button, select SAML, and you will get a drop down of all the identity providers and service providers that you have. Select the one that you have created for this purpose. Select that, and this group name alias is a optional parameter which you need to give in case you want to import a SAML group. And this would be like a group attribute statement. So that attribute statement that we saw earlier, so we also have something called as group attribute statement. So you simply pass this group name there, and just give the name of the attribute here, that is group name. So that is again optional. And the fourth step would be add users or groups to user manager with required roles and permissions. Again, as we saw for LDAP, that step remains the same. And the final step would be to log into ColdFusion Administrator using single sign-on login. So these are the 5 steps involved in SAML login workflow. So we'll see this, how this thing works. So first we'll take LDAP, right? So we come to security page. Now I've logged in currently as the admin itself, and I've selected the separate username and password already. So I can see this external authentication here, and I've selected LDAP. So these are the LDAP details that I've already added. And all these details you will be getting from your LDAP server itself. So I've taken all these details from my LDAP server and I've provided it here. And so when you click on save, there will be one set of connection verification that happens there as well. Or if you need to verify, you can also click on this button. So that will verify the connection for you. So now that connection is verified, everything is good here. I'm going to submit the changes. Now the next step that we saw is user manager page. So you can see here I've already added LDAP group. So there are 3 LDAP groups that I've already added. I've also added a LDAP user. So let me open up this development group that I've created here. So I added development team. I selected external user because it is an external user, and user type is LDAP. Since it's a group, we saw that this is a group and it had a lot of members in it. And so I'm checking this group checkbox. And since I wanted the development team to have all of the permissions, I have I have given everything as allowed, and here expose services, everything is allowed. So I've moved everything to the allowed section for them, and I add the user. So now that this development team group is added, so you can see that there were members Dan and David as a part of the development team, but I have not added those users separately here. I've just added the group. Even though the user is not specifically added here, now I've given I'm trying to log in as Dan. I will still be able to log in with all of these pages available still for me because of the roles and permissions that I had given. And since Dan was a part of the development team, Dan has inherited all of the permissions that I've given for the group. So this was for LDAP. We'll quickly see for SAML as well. I've already added this IDP and SP configuration here. So the next step would be select the SAML. I've selected the name of identity provider, the name of test service provider, and I've given this SAML group name alias. Now I click on submit changes. I come to user manager. So let's open up this group. So development admin, again external user, it's SAML. And since it's a group, I've checked this group checkbox and I've given all of the permissions. Right. So now you will see there's a new button that is added, single sign-on login. So this will still be for a regular user, but for a SAML user, I'll be clicking on this single sign-on login. That will take me to Okta login page. So let's log in as David. Yeah. So since David was a part of the development group in SAML, I will be able to log in as David into ColdFusion Administrator. Yeah. Let's. Yeah. So Alan, I think it should support, but it's not something that we have tested yet. And it's also a new feature in 2023. Currently, we are supporting the LDAP authentication, but this is not something we have tested nor documented as of now. But this could be something that we will look at. Okay, stored in user browser. I am not very sure about this question. I could check and I can let you know. Yeah. Is there anything else?